Everyone, my name is Ravana and I am a tutor here at Chegg, and today I will be giving a lesson on Victorian literature. So first, let's take a quick look at the historical context. So the Victorian era lasts for about 60 years, from 1837 to 1901, and this period is characterized by a few very significant factors. The increase in industrialization means that many factories were looking to move away from manual labor and towards using mechanics. Also, at this time, there was a massive need for easier ways for trading goods, and this saw a need for increasing the number of railways. Following in suit with this process came the change in technology. This was the introduction of the steamship and the first use of electric power. Also, the invention of the telegraph and eventually the telephone, when it would go on to change the way people communicated with one another. As I mentioned before, there was a strong move away from manual labor, but the labor jobs that were available were quite often given to children. The reason being that the wages that a child would make was much less than an adult, and for many companies this was seen as a profitable decision. Now, the literature of this period was quite distinct in the fact that it dealt with new and unique topics. It reflected upon the use of romanticism, crime, poverty, power, politics, gender, sexuality, and was quite often Gothic in nature. So I've picked quite a couple of authors and their most important works. First, we're going to take a look at Charles Dickens. So Charles Dickens is widely considered to be the most famous author of the era. And Charles is born into a very well-off family, but by the time he's 10, his family has suddenly had to move to Camden Town, which was a pretty poor suburb of London. And the reason they're required to move there is because his father was living high above his means, so they're in debt. 2 years later, Charles' father is imprisoned because of this debt, and this means that Charles has to leave school and get a job working in a factory as a way of helping to support his family. So this time in Charles' life really impacted him greatly, and many of his works incorporate the way he reflected upon this time in his life. In 1836, he meets and marries Catherine Hogarth, with whom he goes on to have 10 children, and unfortunately the marriage ends in 1858. Now, there are two theories about why this occurs, one being that the sudden death of their infant daughter in 1851 left them so grief-stricken they could no longer function together as a married couple. The other is that Charles supposedly had an affair with a young actress named Nellie Ternan. At this time, the Dickens family is considered to be quite affluent, but interestingly enough, he only ever made about $95,000 for his written work. While this may seem small by today's standards, it would be about $1.5 billion today. Unfortunately, in 1870, Charles dies from a stroke. Dickens' most well-known work is Oliver Twist. And Oliver Twist is published in 1838, and it tells the story of an orphan boy named Oliver who has been raised in a workhouse. He finds himself suddenly forced into an apprenticeship as an undertaker. Upon being released from the workhouse, he flees to London and quickly joins a gang of pickpockets. Dickens focuses on four main themes in this novel. Dickens wanted to reflect upon the superficial attitudes of Victorian society, because the upper class honestly believed that they were doing everything they could for the poor and often forgot that all people, no matter their class, were human. He wanted to really focus on what poverty meant and did not hold back when he described it in his books. His goal was to show his readers that they did not truly understand what being impoverished meant. Now, Dickens also wanted to discuss the idea of crime and the difference between being born a criminal and an influenced criminal. So while crime was high during the Victorian era, much of it had to do with people being forced into it because of their social standing. So he argued that there was a difference between people that were born into criminal families and born into crime, and those that were forced to commit crime. One of the smaller themes presented in the book deals with the idea of identity. At this period of time, having no true name meant that you'd be totally disregarded in society. So while Oliver has a given name, the made-up surname gives him no social standing whatsoever. Another of Dickens' works is Great Expectations. And Great Expectations is published in 1861 and reflects upon the life of a young boy who has been placed into the care of his strict religious older sister and her blacksmith husband. While this sets him up to become an apprentice to his brother-in-law, he soon finds himself, by chance, funded by an anonymous benefactor. The stipulation is that he is required to use the funds given to him to become a gentleman. So much like the predecessor, Great Expectations has its similarities with themes, but they are present in different manners. So the representation of society and class comes when he is instructed by his patron to become a gentleman, because during this time period, to be considered a part of high society, one must be educated, well-mannered, and don't forget, wealthy. Wealth in this story is equal to love, because without money, what does love mean? And this is reflected strongly throughout the novel. You have a number of characters who refuse to tell the truth about themselves or others, and you specifically have characters that are misdirecting about truth. This is where the themes of deceit and crime work hand in hand. The criminal element is very similar to the one expressed in Oliver, because it deals with the ideas of the supposed criminal class as a new status among society. The reason behind this being the reason behind this being that you do not have to be poor to be a crook. All of the characters have high expectations of themselves, and by the end of the novel, every single one of them has failed at their goal. So the next two authors have a deeper connection to one another, the era, and to the subject of their novels. Patrick Bronte, an Irish clergyman, and his wife Maria have 5 daughters: Elizabeth, Maria, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, and one son named Branwell. Maria dies in 1821 from cancer, leaving her husband alone with the 6 children. Soon after this, the 4 oldest daughters are sent off to a girls' boarding school. In the first few weeks of being there, the girls send home letters to their father, complaining about the conditions at the school, but he refuses to bring them home. And within the year, Elizabeth and Maria die from exposure to tuberculosis or typhoid. And upon returning home, Charlotte quickly takes over the maternal role of the family. In 1839, Charlotte begins to work as a governess to families near her home. After many years of solidarity, in 1854, Charlotte marries Arthur Nichols, the parish priest. And sadly, within a year, Catherine and her unborn child die due to dehydration and malnutrition associated with severe morning sickness. In 1847, Charlotte publishes Jane Eyre under the pseudonym Currer Bell. This book follows the experiences of the title character as she is first raised by an aunt who loathes her, to being sent away to Lowood School, which for Charlotte was truly personal as it reflected her own life. Lowood School was believed to represent the school that her and her sisters were sent to, where her older sisters both died. After leaving the school, Jane became a governess at remote Thornhill Hall and finds herself facing her fears and falling in love. While the perspective of this text is much different to that of Dickens, many of the themes were similarly based. The idea of education is shown as a safe haven for those that choose to utilize it, and women can and will succeed beyond the typical education in music, art, and foreign language. In this novel, society and class were reflected in opposition of one another. Wealth and status appear misguided and corrupt, whereas those who live in poverty are considered to be the moral party. A good portion of the novel is spent trying to teach the reader about what being a moral person is, and that there is a difference between being right and being happy, at least as it's reflected in Victorian society. The writing in this period also took on a certain level of the belief in superstition. In the case of Jane Eyre, while there are superstitious elements, nothing can brace the reader for the fact that reality is in fact far more sinister, and the fact that there is a rational explanation is terrifying. Charlotte's sister Emily is considered to be the most solitary and reclusive of her siblings, so much less is known about her activity. It is known that in 1838 she became a teacher at Law Hill School, but within 6 months left due to severe stress. So she took over the running of the family household and taught herself to speak French and German. In 1848, at the funeral of her brother Branwell, Emily becomes quite ill and soon dies from the effects of tuberculosis. Emily also publishes a book in 1847 under the pseudonym Alice Bell. Her novel Wuthering Heights focuses upon two Yorkshire estates of Thrushcross Grange Manor and Wuthering Heights farmhouse. Orphaned gypsy Heathcliff is taken in and educated by wealthy Mr. Earnshaw, but upon his death, Heathcliff finds himself outcast once again. Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff soon fall in love with one another, but she decides to marry Heathcliff's rival Edgar because Heathcliff has no social standing. Heathcliff plots his revenge to hurt all those who have wronged him. Now, the themes displayed in this novel are a bit different to the previous ones I discussed. In this book, love and revenge coexist with one another, and one cannot survive without the other. And sometimes the lines between the two become blurred. In the beginning, family is seen as an important quality of living properly, but by the end of the novel, it displays all of the qualities that are seen to be dysfunctional. Lots of greed, lots of jealousy, addiction to gambling, drinking, everything that could be wrong in a family. Much like her sister, Emily reflected upon society and class. And that even though the two estates stand in the country, that even then that they're surrounded by this cloud that is social status. This book also has quite a few elements of the supernatural in it, but the dark and sinister side only begins to come through when the past is being reflected upon. So there's quite a few times in the book when there's flashbacks, because you have modern day, and then you have, I think it's 30 years in the past. And when they're reflecting upon the past, there seems to be a lot of ghosts that get dredged up, and the moors are haunted, and lots of things like this. Heathcliff is also seen to be a part of the supernatural element, as it is his appearance in the novel that sets everything in motion. A number of commonalities exist between all four books and even between the three authors. All of these novels have themes based on society and class, and poverty versus wealth. But considerably within the last two, the elements of superstition play a huge role in the shaping of the characters within their respective tales. The authors all seem to reflect on life experiences to convey their thoughts about Victorian society and even their own class standing. Whether as Charles, who was born rich, raised poor, and died rich, whereas the Bronte sisters always lived a very humble lifestyle. It is also important to recognize the use of male pseudonyms by the Bronte sisters. The reason behind this is that their writings would not have been taken very seriously because of their gender. All of the novels discussed in this lesson deal with the human experience and different ways in which society was viewed during the Victorian era. Canadian poet and writer Margaret Atwood put it best when she said, "I was once a graduate student in Victorian literature, and I believe, as the Victorian novelists did, that a novel isn't simply a vehicle for private expression, but that it also exists for social examination." If you would like any more information or have any questions about this subject, please feel free to contact me at the tutoring link below.